The crowd saw him before the state did. That is the image that should bother you first. Not a theory, not a slogan, not a social media clip cut to prove whatever someone already wanted to believe. A live crowd, in broad daylight, pointing toward danger, while the protective system around a former president somehow failed to close the gap fast enough to prevent blood. Death and a permanent wound in public trust. That is where this story begins. Not with the shooter's biography, not with Donald Trump's later comments, not even with the FBI. It begins with a single humiliating fact. Ordinary people in the crowd seem to understand the danger before the security structure built to neutralize danger did. And once that fact lodged in the public mind, the rest of the official story was always going to struggle. Because the real story is not simply whether Thomas Crooks acted alone or whether some darker theory is true. The real story is that Butler became a trust collapse the moment the public concluded that the event was larger than the explanation offered afterward. That is the framework for this entire case. Not secret plot, not final proof. Trust collapse. A former president is hit. A civilian is killed. The shooter is dead. And a year and a half later, the American state still has not produced a public account strong enough to make the average skeptical observer feel the event has actually been explained. That matters more than people in power seem to, because when an event is this big, you do not only need facts, you need narrative force. You need an explanation that feels proportionate to the trauma. It has to answer not only the technical questions, but the emotional ones. It has to sound bigger than the doubt, sturdier than the footage, and more convincing than the speculation. Butler never got that. Instead, it got fragments. The first fragment is the rooftop itself. If you want to understand why this event keeps returning, start there. A gunman gets into position. The crowd notices something is wrong. People point, people shout, the candidate is exposed, then the shot comes. That sequence creates a damage far beyond the physical event because it does something psychologically devastating. It makes the state look slower than the public. The people there were not supposed to have better situational awareness than the protective apparatus. Once that happened, every later explanation had to climb uphill. The second fragment is the aftermath inside the Secret Service. If the state wants the public to believe Butler was an enormous but ordinary security failure, then the state must treat it as an enormous failure in a visible way. Bureaucracies know this instinctively. They fire people, they clear chains of command, they overcorrect, they make a spectacle of accountability because spectacle is one of the few things that can partially restore belief after humiliation. But what has lingered in public memory instead is the opposite feeling that the accountability never looked large enough for the scale of the disaster. That feeling matters. Because incompetence is politically survivable only when the punishment looks bigger than the incompetence. If the failure is world historical and the consequences look bureaucratic, then the incompetence story itself starts sounding weak. That is one of the central reasons Butler will not settle. The explanation is too small for the event. The third fragment is Thomas Crooks himself, or more precisely, how underbuilt he remains in public consciousness. We are far from dealing with a public figure whose motives, habits, digital life, and psychological architecture have been laid out in a way that gives the country closure. The source text you gave me puts real weight on that. It points to claims that Crooks was presented as more or less digitally empty, then later suggests a much richer online trail was out there than the public had been led to believe. Whether every claimed account would survive the highest evidentiary standard is not the deepest issue. The deeper issue is asymmetry. If the FBI knew much more than it publicly said, withholding becomes the scandal. If it did not know much more than it publicly said, then incompetence becomes the scandal. Either way, trust falls. That is what makes Butler so politically dangerous. The institutions do not have a safe lane anymore. Every explanation road seems to carry its own cost. Then there is Donald Trump himself. This is the part of the story that may be the most unsettling because it does not fit the person. Trump is not a man who lets wounds fade. He replays injury, he recycles insult. He metabolizes grievance into power. Butler should have become one of the most important emotional pillars of his political identity. Instead, he put it away. He told the RNC crowd he would speak about it once and not again. That sounded at first like melodrama, but then it turned out to be strangely close to the truth. He does not return to Butler the way he returns to almost every other perceived injury in his life. That is weird. Not proof of staging, not proof of a cover-up, but weird enough to destabilize the ordinary emotional script that people expect from him if the central victim behaves off. Model, the whole event becomes harder to interpret. The public starts asking not only whether the state is explaining Butler well, but whether Trump himself is acting like someone who experienced the event the way the public was told he did. That question alone is enough to keep the wound open. Then comes the foreign link question. This is where careless commentators become useless because they jump from unanswered to proven with no discipline in between. The careful way to say it is this. There were obvious enough reasons for the public to expect visibly exhaustive inquiry into any foreign link angle. And the public does not feel it saw. That the issue is not whether a foreign hand has been proved. The issue is why the visible institutional appetite to eliminate that possibility in public view seems to have felt so weak. That matters because in a trust collapse, silence does not read as professionalism. It reads as management, and management is the exact thing the public fears most in a case like this. Then there is the footage after the shooting. Again, discipline matters. Strange-looking footage does not automatically prove staging. Calm movement by some people does not automatically prove rehearsal. Photographers getting directed into position does not automatically prove prior planning. In crisis scenes, professional behavior can look uncanny, and suspicious viewers can overread ambiguity. All true. But politically, that does not solve the problem, because the issue is not what the footage proves in a courtroom. The issue is what the footage does inside a low-trust environment. In a high-trust environment, ambiguous moments stay ambiguous. In a low-trust environment, ambiguous moments become symbols. They begin carrying more meaning than they deserve because the institutions involved have already burned through the trust reserves that might otherwise contain them. That is what happened here. Butler became a low-trust event almost immediately. And once that happened, every new fact and every missing fact began flowing into the same structure: the roof, the security lapse, the dead bystander. Trump's silence, Crooks's thin public profile, the disputed digital trail, the blocked feeling around certain lines of inquiry, the strange visuals afterward. None of these, by themselves, force a single conclusion together. They make ordinary closure impossible. That is why I think the source text is most powerful when it avoids pretending to solve the event. The strongest argument is not here is what really happened. The strongest argument is the institutions responsible for telling us what happened have failed to produce an explanation strong enough to dominate the event. That is devastating enough, because once the official story becomes weaker than the event starts living on its own terms. It stops being just a criminal episode and becomes a permanent fracture in institutional trust. That is why Butler does not fade. The country can survive tragedy. It can survive incompetence. What it cannot survive cleanly is the feeling that truth itself is being handled timidly after a trauma of this scale. And that is what the authorities never seem to grasp. The public did not need omniscience. It needed visible seriousness equal to the shock of the event. It needed a motive story that felt complete enough to hold. It needed accountability that felt purgative. It needed an investigative posture that looked hungry rather than irritated. It needed the state to behave like it understood how close the country came to something even worse. It did not get that. It got a thin story and a heavy silence. That combination is poisonous, because over time, silence no longer looks like complexity. It starts looking like refusal. Caution starts looking like concealment. Closure starts looking prefabricated. And the official account, rather than settling the case, becomes just one more object of suspicion inside it. That is the real scandal. Not that every alternative theory is true, but that the institutions responsible for the ordinary explanation made the ordinary explanation feel too weak to trust. Once that happens, the public stops asking only what happened in Butler. It starts asking what happened to the institutions that were supposed to make truth believable afterward. That is a much bigger problem, because the lasting damage of Butler may not be what happened on that rooftop. The lasting damage may be what the event taught millions of people about official reality itself. That when something this enormous happens, the state may still be better at managing closure than earning belief. And once people learn that lesson, they do not easily unlearn it. That is why Butler remains open, not because the country has agreed on one theory, but because the country no longer believes the ordinary story is strong enough to close the wound. And in modern politics, a wound the official story cannot close never really stays in the past. It keeps bleeding into the present.